Today on the Perception and Action podcast, can I put some of the sports science I've been talking about into practice and become an ultra runner? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to do something a bit different. Step out of my lab and talk a little bit about what I have going on personally. Specifically, a couple months ago I decided that I wanted to begin tackling ultra marathons. Later this year, I'm going to attempt my first 50K race. And depending on how that goes, I hope to attempt a 50-miler sometime late in 2017. In beginning to prepare for these, I've been thinking a lot about the topics I've been talking about in the podcast, and am trying to apply a bit of the science to my training. So, I thought I would share with you. Today I want to talk through a couple of the psychological aspects of training I've been thinking about. In future episodes, I will cover more topics, post some updates, and some photos. Along the way, I'm also going to review a few relevant articles and talk about some new research I've been doing in this area. Before I get into the science, a little bit about my background and the first race I'm training for. I've been running on and off for about 15 years. I've run a total of 12 marathons, including 7 last year. I'm officially a member of the Marathon Maniacs. My marathon PR is 3:30 and change. In terms of my training, if you're really interested, I've included a link to my Strava page in the show notes, which gives the detail of all my runs. If you're listening to this the day it came out, my first 50K race will be this coming Saturday, October 15th, the Cave Creek Thriller here in Anthem, Arizona. I posted a few pictures of the course and the elevation profile, which you can find by going to the blog post associated with this episode at perceptionaction.com/37D. There are 3 aspects of this course that are relevant for applying some sports science. First, there's a pretty decent, but not really crazy by ultra standards, elevation gain of about 3,500 feet on the course. Second, like most of the trails out here in Arizona, the footing is pretty rough and rocky in many places. Finally, it being fall here in Arizona, it is still likely that the temperature will get up above 90 midway through the race. Okay, with that background, let's look at some of the perception action issues I've been thinking about. Issue number 1, attentional dissociation versus association. As I discussed in episode 14D, when looking at Pearl Zumi's marathon ads, and in episode 36C, in my interview with Kostas Karageorgis talking about the use of music in sport, a key issue related to endurance sports is the question of whether an athlete should associate or dissociate themselves from what is going on. In general, association involves paying attention to the sensations from one's own body, or any pain or discomfort you might be feeling, while dissociation involves focusing on some secondary stimulus, typically music, to take attention away from what is going on with one's own body. As I discussed with Kostas, dissociation can be useful, especially for less experienced athletes, because it can delay the shutdown mechanism in your brain and let you push yourself a little bit further. Also, in general, a dissociative focus leads to better running economy, which is the rate of oxygen consumption for a given running speed. But I'll return to that finding in a minute.
Better run away from me, 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 'cause I'm not that love that you can't ever be sure of. I'm not that love.
Within this associative-dissociative dichotomy, I think there's some important and more subtle distinctions, which I'm going to try to put my own spin on based on the work I've done in other sports. I've made a diagram for this which you can find in the show notes. For an associative focus, I think there are really 4 different categories of attentional states. Number 1, an internal skill focus. That is actually focusing on one's running technique, like whether you're heel or toe striking. Number 2, an internal outcome focus. That is, focusing on the effects that the action you are performing has on your own body. For example, your heart rate and perceived effort. Number 3, an external planning focus. For example, thinking about what route one is going to take through a crowd of runners up ahead. And number 4, an external outcome focus. For example, focusing on how many runners are ahead of you and how fast you're closing in on them. The key here is that all of these are related to the act of running in some way. For a dissociative focus, I think there's 2 different alternatives. Focusing on one's own internal thoughts that are unrelated to running, and 2, focusing on some irrelevant external stimulus like music or pretty scenery going by. Nice work, Rob. You took a simple dichotomy and split it into 6 things. So which one of these attentional states is best? Well, just like has been found in other sports, I think it depends on skill level, but with a little twist here. I think it could be argued that since most people learn to run as a kid, in terms of the basic task of running, everyone is an expert. For this reason, the 2 internal associative attentional foci, that is focusing on your body sensations or focusing on your running technique, should have negative consequences for most runners. A focus on body sensations should limit your ability to endure, while a technique focus should mess up the highly proceduralized and automatic act that is running. All of the external foci should result in better performance, which is generally what is found in the research in this area. I think a couple issues that are even more relevant than expertise to this question is whether or not you're a competitive runner or not, and the type of course that you're running on. For most runners, like myself, the position of other runners is pretty irrelevant, as we're usually just running against our own PR, as opposed to actually trying to win the race. So, focusing on an external relevant stimulus versus an external irrelevant stimulus like music will probably be about the same for non-competitive runners. It's just that it's probably easier to do the latter. In terms of the type of course, this is where things get really interesting for me in terms of my own personal training. One of the things that I've really enjoyed about transitioning from road races to running on technical trails like we have here in Arizona is that you don't really have much choice about where your attention goes with the latter. At least 90% of the time, you better be planning your route through the uneven ground, or you're going to roll an ankle or biff it, my friend. An external planning focus will likely not only result in better running performance, it is pretty much necessary to keep you upright. So, in a nutshell, I think in general an external focus of attention is best for runners, but what exact external stimulus you focus on will depend on your level of competition and the type of course. In an interesting recent study, Schucker and colleagues from the University of Munster directly compared a few of the different attentional alternatives. Participants in the study were 30 healthy active people that did not run regularly. There were 3 different attentional conditions, which lasted 6 minutes each on a treadmill. First, an internal associative outcome focus condition in which participants were instructed to focus on their pattern of breathing. Second, an internal associative skill focus condition in which they were asked to focus on the movements of their legs and feet. And finally, third, an external associative outcome focus in which participants watched the progression in a video of a simulated running course. What was found? The external focus resulted in significantly higher running economy than either of the 2 internal conditions. Furthermore, in the external condition, average heart rate was significantly lower than in the internal skill focus condition. So, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, even for quote-unquote inexperienced runners, an external focus of attention results in better performance. However, I think this also raises another important issue. Most previous studies on the relationship between attentional focus and sports performance have used relatively short duration tasks, where it's fairly easy to keep focused on only one thing. Even in this running study, trials were only 6 minutes. Is it possible to maintain a constant attentional focus when we're talking about endurance running, where the action lasts at least 2 hours and sometimes over 24? Over these time spans, attention is much more likely to be transient and dynamic. For example, you might listen to music for a few miles of the marathon to distract yourself from the pain, then focus on runners ahead of you to try to catch them in the last few miles. Subjectively, and in talking with other runners, I think attention wanders around a lot during the course of the race, and people have a pretty difficult time telling you what they were focusing on at any given moment. Another issue is, of course, that almost all running studies involve the use of a treadmill, so route planning demands are pretty minimal. Anyways, just to end off this issue of focus of attention, in terms of my specific training, I've pretty much been using a purely dissociative external strategy, listening to podcasts or music for training runs done on the road, and an associative external strategy, planning where my feet will go for training runs on trails. I don't take my music with me on the trails at all. In the future, I will consider how these two compare and may or may not transfer to race day. The other issue I want to consider in today's episode is downhill running. I just said a few moments ago that I think we're all essentially quote-unquote expert runners. Well, the one situation where that might not be true is downhill running over highly technical rough terrain. This is a skill that I think most people still need to acquire. That is, of course, if they have any desire to do so. There are a couple of really interesting psychological aspects. First is simply overcoming the fear. If you watch an inexperienced person run down a rough downhill trail, they typically lean their body backwards and make long strides in which each foot is staying in contact with the ground for a relatively long time. So in other words, they're trying to slow themselves down by resisting gravity and constantly applying the brakes. I have included a link to a video of elite ultrarunner Kilian Jornet in the show notes, which shows how it's actually supposed to be done. Letting yourself go, or what ultrarunners call bombing the downhill, is much more like dancing than running, with the feet touching the ground for only brief moments between short, choppy strides. Like with a lot of sports skills, becoming an effective downhill runner also seems to involve learning to look in the right place. Here's a quote from Kilian Jornet on the topic. To go downhill technical terrain fast, you cannot look to your feet because they will go too slowly. You need to look 10 feet in front of you and maybe 5 feet if it's very technical. For that, you need to memorize the terrain to know how you need to put your feet and have this coordination. You can practice this with some exercise like trying to run with your eyes closed for 3 seconds. You memorize this terrain, and for these 3 seconds, you run and you know where you need to put your feet. While I think his notion that you memorize the terrain is incorrect, this can be related back to the work on walking over rough terrain by Brett Fagan I talked about back in episode 15. Running downhill effectively involves planning feet placement a few steps ahead of time. Then while those steps are being executed, you're looking ahead to plan the next ones. So at no time are you actually really looking where your feet are landing. But that doesn't mean you're not perceiving anything about the contact with the ground. Again from Jornet. It's with your feet that you touch and realize how the surface is. You need to have a lot of perception in the ankles. You see a lot of rock and you go there with your foot, and it's when the foot touches the rocks that you say, okay, I'll stay like this, or I will make it more strength on the right side or the left side to keep the body in a good position. I think what he's referring to here is tuning into your proprioceptive senses. That is from your tendons and your joints. One of the things that I can almost guarantee will happen if you try downhill running on a trail is what I call near ankle twists. That is where you place your foot on an uneven surface, you feel your ankle start to roll, but correct the position just in time to avoid it. Unfortunately, and mostly due to the practicality of doing it, I haven't been able to find any research on the skill of downhill running, so I'm hoping to do a little informal data collection myself. Okay, time to cross the finish line on this episode of the Perception Action Podcast. Assuming I survive my race this coming weekend, I'll be back to talk more about perception and action in ultrarunning. In particular, one issue I'm interested in is how to achieve a good balance between specificity in training and making adaptations by practicing in conditions different than those you expect during a race. As always, you can contact me via email, robgray@asu.edu, follow me on Twitter @ShakyWeights, and find all the information about the podcast at perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.